Welcome to my video on protectionism and preferential trade. The diagrams that we will look at in this video can seem quite complicated. We are looking at them because it allows you to analyse the perspectives of various stakeholders. Please pause the video after I've explained each diagram to ensure that you have the relevant notes. Governments might want to use protectionist policies. Governments might want to impose certain trade barriers to tackle the disadvantages of free trade. To protect jobs, there may be a risk of too many job losses if domestic firms are outcompeted by foreign firms. To protect infant industries that are just starting out, particularly in developing countries, struggle to compete with international companies. Governments might choose to impose trade barriers until the companies are big enough to compete. However, there's a risk that the industry may never become truly competitive, and in the meantime, domestic consumers are stuck with higher prices or low quality goods. To ban certain goods. The government may simply want to ban certain goods altogether because they consider them to be bad for society, e.g. firearms or drugs. To avoid over-dependence. Specialisation could lead to over-dependence on one industry, for example Nigeria and oil. To protect against dumping. When companies sell goods abroad at a price that's below the production cost to try to force other countries' domestic producers out of business. And finally, to correct imbalances on the balance of payment. We have covered this in the balance of payment video. There are various tariff and non-tariff policies governments can use to protect domestic industries. Before we go any further, it's worth pointing out that non-tariff policies are just any barriers which don't involve actual tariffs. Tariffs can be used or can be imposed in the form of a tax on selected imports. This makes imports more expensive, which helps domestic manufacturers to compete and raise tax revenue for the government. Quotas can be fixed, which limit the quantity of a certain good that can be imported. Any demand for the good above the quota will be diverted to domestic products. In other words, if there's only, say, 1,000 cars that can be imported into the country, and there's 1,001 cars that's demanded, the final car will have to be produced or consumed from domestic production. Embargoes, otherwise known as bans. These can be imposed on certain products. These are usually restricted to extreme cases, e.g. drugs or elephant ivory, but may also be for political reasons. For example, if two countries are having a disagreement, they might impose embargoes on imports from each other, such as experience with the United States and Cuba in the past. Embargoes tend to be less about protecting domestic industries and more about politics or enforcing laws. The value of the currency can also be reduced. In other words, devaluation if we're talking about fixed exchange rates. This raises the price of foreign imports and lowers the value of domestic exports. There could also be tighter product standard regulations which can be imposed. Foreign products which don't comply with the requirements cannot be imported. Product standard regulations could include things such as high safety standards or low emissions requirements. These might be used for environmental or consumer protection or to help domestic industries that can comply with the regulations. Subsidies can be given to domestic producers. This reduces the cost of production of domestic products, making them cheaper to buy. But subsidies can be costly to a government. They're obviously going to also impose an opportunity cost in the government spending. as the government may forego expenditure on education, for instance. Some of these policies that I've noted above, particularly tariffs and subsidies, can be used to make a country's products seem more competitive. That is, by making domestically products seem relatively cheaper. Also, I want to point out that trade disputes occur when one country or trading bloc is seen to be acting unfairly when trading internationally. Trade disputes might be caused by the use of protectionist policies. For example, one country may see the subsidies paid by another country's government to one of its domestic industries as unfair. For example, the EU and Airbus is seen as unfair by the Americans and their company, or largest aeroplane manufacturer, Boeing. Let's start by talking about tariffs. Tariffs, or custom duties, are taxes on imported products. They are usually an ad valorem form, that is, a percentage tax, levied as a percentage increase on the price of the imported product. Tariffs are one of the oldest and most pervasive forms of protection and barriers to trade. The example below relates to the Corn Laws, when tariffs and restrictions on imported food and grain, corn in other words, were enforced in Great Britain between 1815 and 1846. They were designed to keep grain prices high to favour domestic British producers. Okay, so if we look at the diagram, we can see PE. Now PE here is where if the corn was supplied entirely by the domestic producer. In other words, at this point here, supply and demand are exactly equal. All corn is provided by the domestic farmer. However, this is obviously not the case because we have S world below. So if you can see S world just below where I've just circled here, we can see that the price is much lower than the initial equilibrium. Okay, so there's an elastic supply, a perfectly elastic supply of corn at the P world price. In other words, more corn can be supplied at that price than the demand would be. So almost an infinite supply of corn. Once we add the tariff, we can see that the price increases to PW plus T. So the consequence straight away is that domestic demand reduces from Q2 to Q4. So there's been a reduction in the quantity demanded. The domestic supply, on the other hand, has now increased. So it was Q1 and has now gone up to Q3. Well, it's unsurprising that the quantity demanded has increased, quantity supplied increased by domestic producers because of the higher price, i.e. once the tariff was added. So what's the consequence of that? Well, before, what was happening, Q1 to Q2 was the quantity that was being imported into the UK, this distance from here to here. However, after the tariff was imposed, we've said that domestic producers increased output from Q1 to Q3. We've also said that foreign producers, consumers, domestic UK consumers, demanded slightly less corn. Their demand fell from Q2 to Q4. The result is that the new import level fell Q3 to Q4. So imports reduced. So what happened then? Well, the domestic producer, their revenue, i.e. the price times quantity, was originally just A. But once the tariff was introduced, they increased their quantity supplied and therefore the tariff revenue, or their revenue, the revenue that is of the domestic producer increased. It became ABFGH. So to reiterate, this area here. In contrast, the foreign produced revenue fell. It was BCDE, so this area here, but once the tariff was introduced, domestic production increased and the amount of imported goods fell to just CD. So this was the new revenue for the foreign producer. So reiterate, CD. Some of the more attentive of you will notice that I and J has not been accounted for. J is, of course, the tariff revenue that goes to the government. Before, at P World, there was no government tariff revenue, as there was no tariff. What else can we see then? Well, the consumer surplus has also shrunk. It is shrunk by the area F, G, H, I, J, K. Look, here was the consumer surplus before, all this area, but once the tariff was imposed, it fell to here. The consumer surplus had shrunk by this area after the introduction of the tariff. The producer surplus, on the other hand, had increased. So this was the producer surplus before. Once the tariff had been introduced, the domestic producer surplus grew by F and G. This was great news for the producer. Overall, we cannot account for areas H and K. This is a deadweight loss. A tariff is bad news overall for society. So, having seen the diagram, I've mentioned a lot of letters to you and numbers and equilibriums. I've summarised this on this table here. The most important things to note then can be as follows. The domestic producer is now better off. That's the first thing to note. The foreign producer is now worse off. The government is now better off because it's getting tariff revenue. Bad news for the consumer because they're paying higher prices. Again, good news for the domestic producer because they're benefiting from the higher prices at the expense of the consumer. But overall, deadweight loss of H and K means it's bad news. A tariff leads to a deadweight loss. Just a couple more points I want to make regarding tariffs. Okay, and that basically is me linking it back to comparative advantage. The law of comparative advantage is based on several assumptions which make it hard to apply to the real world. For example, it assumes there are no economies or diseconomies of scale, that there are no transport costs or barriers to trade. There's perfect knowledge and the factors of production are mobile. Also, externalities are ignored. The other thing to note is that tariffs distort comparative advantage. Quotas. The first thing to note with quotas is that the price will increase. From P World, remember supply is perfectly elastic because more, in this case trousers, can be supplied than we would ever demand in the country. So price would increase from P World to PW plus quantity. In addition, domestic demand would reduce from Q2 to Q4. There will be a contraction in demand, this point to this point, because of the higher prices. Consumers no longer want to purchase as many trousers. Before the quota, the domestic quantity supplied was 0 to Q1. 0 to Q1. And that's that green area we can see in the diagram. Between Q1 and Q2, this was the quantity that was imported into the country prior to the introduction of the quota. That is the blue area. So as you can see in the diagram, after the quota was introduced, the price became higher. So in total, the quantity demanded became Q4. So it's this area we need to explore and see what's happened. Who is providing what? Is it domestic producers or is it foreign producers? The next thing to show is that this area here, I'll just put that in green for a blue for a second. This area here shows the quantity of goods imported after the quota is introduced, area Q1 to Q3. Therefore, we can show how much the domestic producer benefited from the introduction of the quota. Initially, their revenue was simply A, price times quantity. But after the quota, remember the quota made the price increase. Look over here, the price increased. So after the quota, their new revenue was A and F, but also remember that this quantity here in sky blue highlighted is imported, but the remainder I, J, beg your pardon, and C was now provided by domestic production. This is a very complicated diagram and will take some time to understand. So don't panic if you haven't understood it immediately. Okay, so before there was no quota and the quantity imported was this area here. I changed the colour, it's getting a little bit messy now. Was this area here. That was the quantity imported. But the whole point of a quota is to limit the number of goods coming into the country. Therefore, we can conclude straight away that BCD can no longer be the revenue earned by foreign producers. Instead, it's going to be, let's cut that back in green, this area here. So G, H, and B. So the foreign producers have now seen their revenue fall. There is obviously no government revenue. It's going to be zero because a quota is not a tax like a tariff. We can also say that the consumer surplus originally was this area here at the lower price. But once we introduced the tariff, I beg your pardon, the quota, we can see that the price went up to PWQ. So consequently, the consumer surplus triangle shrunk. It shrunk by this area here at the bottom. That was how much it shrunk by. So the reduction in consumer surplus was area F, G, H, I, J, and K. So I'm just going to tidy up the diagram so you can see what's happened to the producer surplus. So the producer surplus was this area here, okay, when there was no quota. After the quota, it led to a higher price. Now, I wouldn't get too bogged down in the shape of it, but what we can see, look, is that the price has increased, okay? This is effectively the supply curve now for the domestic quantity, so that becomes the supply curve. Therefore, the producer surplus has grown by this shaded yellow area, and that shaded yellow area is F, G, H, and I. So what does that leave us with then? Well, remember we said about 30 seconds ago that the consumer surplus was now this area here. So the consumer surplus shrunk. And as it shrunk, because of the higher prices, this benefited the domestic producer in F, G, H, and I. What it hasn't accounted for, however, are these two here, look. J and K. Therefore, J and K, the reduction in the consumer surplus, that benefit has not been transferred to anyone else. So therefore, the dead weight loss is areas J and K. So who are the winners and losers? Well, the winners from this are clearly the domestic producer who's now earned more revenue. The losers from this are clearly the consumer paying higher prices, and also the foreign producer who is now earning less revenue in terms of exports from providing us with trousers. So here is a summary of what we've just looked at with regards to figure 3 and the effects of adding a quota. Another form of protectionism I would like to tell you about is called a voluntary export restraint. I'm not going to provide the diagram for this, but they can be found in my set of notes. A voluntary export restraint, VER, is where two countries make an agreement to limit the volume of their exports to one another over an agreed time period. For example, when the automobile industry in the United States was threatened by the popularity of cheaper, more fuel-efficient Japanese cars, a 1981 voluntary restraint agreement between the Japanese and US governments limited the Japanese to exporting 1.7 million cars to the US annually. Interestingly, the Japanese car companies circumvented this eventually by building plants in America. In other words, the VER restricted the flow of Japanese cars into the US since the Japanese were a larger exporter of cars, e.g. Toyota, Nissan, etc., to the US. The supply of cars to the US market fell and led to excess demand for Japanese cars in the US. The excess demand induced an increase in the price of cars, and therefore the demand for Japanese cars fell in the United States. So this is interesting because both countries are engaging or agreeing almost in a form of protectionism for one country. Quite a rarity in exploring protectionism with economics. Domestic subsidies. Domestic subsidies are an aid for domestic businesses facing financial problems. Examples include subsidies for car manufacturers or loss-making airlines. So the first thing to note on this diagram is that the price is actually unchanged. So you can see we've got PE up here. That price was never actually being used because we were importing goods at P World. Okay, so in other words, instead of the domestic producer providing QE, they were just providing Q1. So that's the first thing to note, that the price was always regarding P World. So therefore, as the subsidy shifted supply to the right, the price remained unchanged at P World. You heard that correctly. The price remained unchanged at P World. Thus, as the price remained unchanged at P World, the quantity demanded of Q2, quantity of flights in this example, remains unchanged as well because we've still got the same price of P World. However, the imports reduced from Q1 to Q2, so I'll just mark that on here. So the imports reduced from Q1 to Q2 from Q1 to Q2 to just Q2 to Q3. Let's make that a bit clearer. So from Q2 to Q3. So to repeat, imports reduced from Q1 to Q2, the green line, and they fell to Q2 to Q3. In other words, Q1 to Q3 was now being supplied domestically. That was flights being supplied by the domestic airline. So on our diagram, we can see that the domestic producer, the revenue was initially just A. However, after the introduction of the subsidy, they were now supplying 0 to Q3, but, and this is the key thing here, they had now increased their revenue to A, B, E, F, G. In other words, EFG represents the subsidy, but it should still be included in the firm's revenue as the firm is earning this money as well as the income from selling the number of flights. So what we'll do is we'll now shade in this new revenue for the firm, the domestic firm. In contrast, the foreign produced revenue was B, C, and D. Okay, so that was the quantity being imported times by the price, so it would have been this area in green. However, after the subsidy had been introduced, they were just providing area B. Okay, so let's just correct that a second. Oh, so if I go back up to here. So what happened then? B, C, and D, okay, were the initial revenue earned by the foreign firms. Obviously, B has now gone to the domestic producer. So therefore, the foreign firms have now just got revenue of C and D. So their revenue has shrunk from B, C, D to just C and D. So one final point to make here then. We've obviously said that green is the revenue for the foreign firms. Red is the revenue for the domestic firms. But to reiterate, part of that revenue has come from the subsidy provided by the government. So we can see the government subsidy here. So the distance between these two lines times by the quantity. So this would actually be, change the pen, the subsidy for the government. So this is the government subsidy provided to the domestic firms. So the next thing to note is that the consumer surplus remains unchanged because the price has not fallen or, for that matter, increased. The price remains unchanged, so consumer surplus has not changed. The producer surplus, on the other hand, has increased by areas E and F. So this was our original producer surplus. Remember, we've got the subsidy on top. So the benefit of the subsidy in part goes to the producer. So this leaves area G unaccounted. So this leaves area G in green. G is unaccounted for. As we've just said, there is no increase in the consumer surplus, so it cannot be deemed to be a benefit to anybody. It cannot be attached to a benefit to the producer surplus because it's of where it's located, and therefore it can only be seen as a negative. Negative because it's a cost to the government of having paid out for the subsidy. So overall, the deadweight loss to society of domestic subsidies is area G. Some people don't think protectionism is a good thing. Restricting imports reduces specialisation. diverting resources away from their most efficient use. This reduces allocative and productive efficiency. Protectionism will mean prices tend to be higher for both consumers and producers, as there's a lack of specialisation and competition. And imports may be more expensive, e.g. through tariffs. If the price of everyday goods, e.g. food, rises, this will have a bigger impact on the poor than on the rich. As a result, there may be an increase in inequality, and it's likely that living standards will fall. Protectionism also reduces choice for consumers. Once trade barriers are in place, it can be difficult to remove them. Industries may depend on them to survive, so removing them could destroy domestic industries. If demand for imports is high, this could be due to poor domestic efficiency. A lack of competition doesn't encourage firms to improve their efficiency, so there'll continue to be a misallocation of resources. Firms are likely to make more money, especially in the long run, if they improve efficiency instead of relying on protectionist policies. Finally, trade barriers imposed by one country may lead to retaliation by other countries. This is often referred to as a trade war. It reduces world trade and worsens other problems. E.g., there'll be a further misallocation of resources caused by inefficiency and a lack of specialisation. But let's not forget that we started our look at protectionism by exploring why governments might wish to protect their domestic industries. For instance, we discussed, in one way or another, the infant industries, the preventing of dumping, the protection of jobs, raising tariff raises tax revenues. It could also prevent the establishment of a foreign-based monopoly in a country. Obviously, we also talked about the balance of payments. So again, I suggest you refer back to my notes at this point. The notes, it's worth looking at preferential trading arrangements. That is a trade agreement whereby trade between the signatories is freer than trade with the rest of the world. So we have touched upon this already. The sorts of things we looked at were free trade areas, customs unions, single markets, those sorts of things. Economic unions, of course, monetary unions. We've got some examples here. So again, all of this is in the notes. We looked at trade creation, trade diversion already. So thank you very much for listening.